We knew Indiana would be interested in Scott Drew, but now is Scott Drew secretly interested in Indiana? Let's get Locked On Baylor.
You are Locked On Baylor, your daily podcast on the Baylor Bears. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello there, Bears fans. Welcome to another episode of Locked On Baylor, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day. I'm your host, Cam Stewart, ESPN Central Texas, and The Cam Show on YouTube, live every weekday, high noon Eastern time, and wherever you get your podcast. Thank you guys for making this your first listen today and every day. We're looking at, this is basically the coaching carousel episode, which is a weird one to have on February 25th, but there's all of a sudden stuff happening around Baylor and around this conference that could affect Baylor. So first we'll talk this Scott Drew Indiana nonsense, or is it nonsense? Utah went out and fired their coach for some reason, and that might actually benefit Baylor, weirdly enough. And let me just ask you this one question before we get there. Would you like it if your best ever coach was just helping another team in your conference casually hire another coach? Let's address all that and more on this episode of Locked On Baylor, starting with the Hoosiers. So I said on this show, it was actually in a crossover with Locked On Big 12, which we will hear a little bit of a conversation with Drake later on. But I said on the Locked On airwaves a few weeks ago that there's some chance for Scott Drew to Indiana, some. I wouldn't completely put it to bed, but as much as you can put it to bed after somebody said no to Kentucky, right? When I say there's some chance, I mean there's a single-digit % chance, probably less than 5% chance, right? But the uglier the season gets for Baylor, the more it starts to creep into the fans' minds. I don't think Scott Drew's going to ditch after one mediocre year that they make the NCAA tournament after how he started at Baylor. But hey, that's got to creep in to creep into your mind a little bit the more that this happens. And from the Indiana standpoint, of course, they want Scott Drew, right? Someone wants Scott Drew every year. Everyone's going to have their carousel where they're interested in Scott Drew. And of course, Indiana's going to want him. He's a guy who's young enough to kind of start over at a pretty high floor. He's an Indiana guy, this, that, and the other. But I didn't realize, apparently, that Scott Drew is conveying interest in the job. Our man from the Locked On Podcast Network, Locked On Hoosiers, Jacob Goins, had an episode yesterday where he was talking about the next kind of wave of who Indiana's going to look at after Dusty May signs an extension and Brad Stevens says no. Of course, Scott Drew is going to be on that kind of next part of the short list. But what might surprise you is what Jacob says at the end here.
Again, Brad Stevens says no, and Dusty May says no. So, ultimately, you go down the list. And I think Scott Drew is a very good third option and can now become your top option if you want him to. Scott Drew has won forever. He's been at Baylor forever. And it just makes sense to move in his direction. A guy that has been coaching for 23 years. Remember, he started way back when at Valpo, and now he's been at Baylor. He's got a 65% winning percentage. This guy's a Final Four. He's a national championship coach. I mean, this guy's got it all. And he has made it known on the back end in his circle he would be interested in this job.
Has he? Has he now? Apparently, Scott Drew's made it known on the back end within his circle that he's interested in the Indiana job. Now, there are all kinds of back channels to this, right? Coaches don't ask athletic directors, hey, you looking around? I might throw my hat in the ring. No, this goes through agents. This goes through friends of friends, other assistant coaches, other places, yada, yada. But if that is the case, certainly Mac Rhodes at Baylor would know too. I find it interesting. By the way, if I had the pipes of Jacob, if I talked like that, boy, I'd be in a top 5 market in America, man. I guess it's just not in me. But Scott Drew, looking at Indiana and having that interest in that job does perplex me a little bit. We talk about this later on in my discussion with Drake about, how much does it mean that he is from Indiana? Like, first off, I don't know that they had a basketball goal in the driveway with the IU Hoosiers logo. His dad was coaching college basketball somewhere else. Okay. And the other thing is, I wonder how Indiana fans would get behind that. Because remember last year, all the Kentucky fans, especially after they missed out, after Scott Drew turned them down, they were like, we didn't want him anyway. He couldn't handle this. He can't handle this. He can't handle the fishbowl that is Lexington. And hey, there's something to that. Baylor is not Kentucky when it comes to the magnifying glass that it's put on you. But Kentucky and Indiana are not all that much different. So why is it that he can't handle Lexington? That seemed to be, kind of the across the board of, consensus from analysts and Kentucky fans that he can't handle that kind of thing. And then he just walks into Indiana, which has a rabid fan base like Kentucky, just without the success, without a fraction of the success the last 25 years. I'm sure that would go over pretty well, if you ask me. Guys, I know you're going to be hearing it a lot, and it's something we will revisit. And if something changes, maybe my opinion will. But right now, I'm putting it at a less than 5% chance he goes to Indiana. And the main reason why is, why would you? Indiana, great fans, perfect pants, all kinds of resources, glorious history. Lord knows I'm a history nut. I love that stuff. But this is Indiana in the Big 2025. This is Nebraska football. This is a place that has not gotten the coaching hire right in over a decade. And it's become this wasteland the last couple of selections. And even Crean, who was a good coach, it's not like he had him playing for a national championship, which is the expectation in Indiana. So I don't know if he's saying no to Kentucky, why he's rushing to get off his sofa and get to Indiana. And I know Indiana fans will be like, you don't understand. It's the blue blood, the pants, Assembly Hall, the national championships, Isaiah Thomas and Bobby Knight and Steve Alford. I get it. But it's 2025. We're not living there anymore. This is not just throw on the striped pants and go to the Final Four. Indiana, historically, of course, much better program than Baylor. But if we're talking about the best jobs to have in 2025, with clearly the NIL freedom that he's had at Baylor the last couple of seasons, they're not that far off in terms of prestige, man. Because certainly, Kentucky is more prestigious than Baylor, and he turned them down too. I don't see it. I don't see where Indiana makes up that ground. And hey, maybe this NIL, kind of space at Baylor for basketball is really changing in the next couple of months and into next season. Maybe that's the case. But even then, there's a lot that has to be on your side to get Scott Drew to leave Baylor. Kentucky not only has the pedigree of Indiana and the fan base that Indiana has and the resources that Indiana has, but they're also much better right now. It'd be a tough draw, Hoosiers. And if this is a place that worshipped the ground Bobby Knight walked on, Scott, you might need to warm up to a guy like Scott Drew first. Maybe ease yourself into that. I don't know. Speaking of the coaching carousel, it's starting to move in the Big 12 right now. And while it hasn't affected Baylor yet, it may benefit Baylor in the very near future. Let's talk about it next on Locked On Baylor. But first, this episode of Locked On Baylor is brought to you by Prize Picks. Our good friends over there. March basketball is nearly here. Next week, we'll be talking about it. And there's no better way to get in on the action than with Prize Picks, the best place for daily fantasy sports. With Prize Picks, you pick more or less on at least 2 player projections. And if you're right, you can win up to 1,000 times your cash. It's fast, it's easy, and it keeps every game exciting. Build your lineups by day. Like, look, guys, today, Whatever the number is for Luka Doncic in points in his return to Dallas, I'm taking the over, okay? And I love how I can make my picks in less than 60 seconds and then stay engaged all game long, even if it's a laugher. Because when I win, my money hits my account in as little as 15 minutes. No waiting around. I don't like waiting around when it comes to money. Download the app today and use the code LOCKEDONCollege to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's Locked On, COLLEGE, for $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks. Do me a favor. Run your game. So Scott Drew, Indiana, kind of a coaching carousel thing there. Probably not going to happen. What has happened in the Big 12, shockingly, on Monday, is Utah just went out and fired Craig Smith, their head coach. Whoa. I don't know about you guys, but that came across my radar, and I was like, what? It's Goodman. Like, Goodman can be a tool, but he doesn't get it wrong, right? It's true. Craig Smith has been fired at Utah, even though the Runnin' Utes are one of the hottest teams in the conference right now. They just did the Kansas sweep last weekend. They're probably still not going to make the tournament, but they're certainly making things interesting at now 7-9 in the Big 12. Utah says that's not good enough. We had higher expectations than that. Maybe they saw Baylor lose to Colorado on Saturday and said, how do we lose to that team twice? You know what? Get out of here. Yeah, maybe. But it's kind of wild that here's a team in their first year in the Big 12. You knew they weren't going to compete in the Big 12 anyway, right? Like, we all knew that. I think they were picked to finish last. Like, nobody expected them to be making any noise. They don't make any noise for the first half of the conference schedule, and then they do. And then they're all of a sudden a kind of a danger team to be facing right now in March. They're desperate. They're playing good basketball. They're playing full court. Like, it's kind of fun to watch this Utah team the last couple of games, even though they really don't have much of any talent. And Craig Smith is gone midway through year one in the Big 12. There's two things that affects Baylor here with this firing. The first one being, a lot of people will say, wow, Utah gave up on their guy year one, tough place to coach, really. But the flip side of that coin is they see what BYU's doing. They see that BYU's got an NBA coach coming in running an NBA system, and some powerful alums are pouring a ton of money into a program that's right down the road. Why can't we do that? That's what Utah's got to be thinking. So first way it affects Baylor is this is only going to make the Big 12 better. Oh, just what we need. A better Big 12, right? That's just what we need here. It's coming. It's coming because now Utah is going to flash some cash and really put some money into this basketball program. So and certainly they've done that in football in the NIL era to mixed results, but good success at the beginning of the NIL era. So that's something to look out for all the teams in the Big 12. The other thing is, how often do we see it, man? Coach gets fired, especially midseason. There's a mass exodus. There's a last one out of town, turn out the lights. Remember John Calipari? Remember him? Arkansas coach comes in day one, introductory press conference, says, I met with the team. There is no team, especially in basketball. Happens a lot in football too, but in basketball, it's usually a big time exodus. Get everyone out of there. And they will have, of course, their free reign with the portal now to go wherever they please. Is there anyone on this Utah basketball roster that sticks out to you that could help Baylor in 2025-26? Anybody that we're familiar with on that Utah roster? Anybody? Bueller? Well, Caleb Lohner's not coming back, okay, first off. Second, Baylor might be in need of a point guard next year, okay? Rob Wright is going to get some NBA draft buzz. I don't know that it's nailed on that he's just going to go. But he's impressed scouts this year. And best believe once we get closer to the draft, because they're not going to make a deep run in the NCAA tournament. You're not going to see anything like that. But as we get closer to the draft, you'll hear, oh, they like this kid. The measurables aren't quite there, but they like his basketball IQ. They like the way he carries himself. The stats are good. He's ahead of schedule in terms of his development because he's still only supposed to be a senior in high school right now. There's going to be legit draft buzz for Rob Wright. Now, he's got to be probably top, like first round, obviously, and probably, top 20 or so to leave college with the money he could make in college next year. But there's that real possibility that he's gone next year. Oh, by the way, Jeremy Roach is gone next year. And oh, by the way, Jaden Nunn is gone next year. So in that realistic, not nailed on, but realistic scenario that Rob Wright does go to the NBA draft, what do you got? What do you got at point guard? Here's a chance to go out and get a crafty Finnish point guard who has all kinds of Big 12 experience, our old friend, Miro Little. I liked Miro when he was here. Obviously, we didn't see a ton of him in 23-24. He was a freshman. He played like a minute a game. You didn't see a ton of him, but I really liked when they recruited him. I liked kind of his style. It's actually not much different from Rob Wright's style. Rob is just considerably better at it. And I think of a guy who's now it's almost like in soccer. If you guys follow European soccer and you put a guy out on loan, he goes and plays for another team, usually in a smaller division, and just gets kind of like a year under his belt. That's kind of what you would be doing with Miro Little. Okay, Miro, you're going to play in the Big 12. You're going to learn how to play in the Big 12. We're going to send you off to the Little Sisters of the Poor over at Utah. They barely know they have a basketball team. And then a year later, when we really need you, we'd love to have you come back. We'll even give you some money this time. Actually, I don't know if he can make money being a European. Anyway, I think it's one that Baylor would need to look at if they fear Rob Wright is going to go in the NBA draft. Now, that is going to be exactly what it takes. Like, Wright will need to get a legit buzz, or they should have an inkling that he's going to go before Miro Little commits, because then he would be like, why would I come back to play on the bench a second time at Baylor? But I see Miro as, a diet Rob Wright, man. He's got some offensive skill. He was really getting after it on the defensive end when he played last year. His numbers are still not great, but he's playing more. He's playing 19 minutes a game, man. That's huge. He's playing half the game. He looks kind of creepy in his headshot for Utah. Look that up if you haven't seen it. At 5 points a game, 3.5 assists. The problem is he's shooting 32%, which I don't love. But that is something that kind of comes along with time, especially at the college level. Jalen Bridges was not a great shooter his first couple years at West Virginia either. So it's something that's kind of the easy part to develop, so to speak. You can't make him a high volume scorer, but you can make him a more efficient player and a better shooter. So now all of a sudden, this Craig Smith firing could really help Baylor by getting their point guard for next year. Maybe I'm just thinking out loud. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. Be sure to like and subscribe on the channel. It helps out a ton. Should Miro Little come back? Will Scott Drew even be here next year? Let me know down in the comments below. And to finish off the coaching carousel episode, we've got to talk about this weird Bill Self thing and how it affects our conference. It's odd. It's really odd. I'm going to sit down with Drake Toll of Locked On Big 12. We'll ask the question, should your legendary head coach be helping out rivals in your own conference? We'll talk about that next on Locked On Baylor.
Bill Self leaving Kansas. This was a more prevalent storyline after the Jayhawks were roughed up against Utah and roughed up against BYU. Bill Self comes to the podium and says, I really thought this would be a fun getaway for our team. We'd go to the mountains and find serenity. We actually all hate each other and need to please get away from one another. They win on Saturday. It all kind of comes out in the midweek that Self was in conversations for the Oklahoma State job. This is Brett McMurphy saying that Bill Self spoke to them, answered questions about the job, offered opinion, and is now a member at Karsten Creek. He said one of the country's top golf courses. Okay. He's an out of area member of their golf country club thing. And this all to me, the woes of Kansas last year, the woes they've faced this year, kind of points toward Bill Self. If he's going to make that Oklahoma State move, making that move, if he's going to retire, this seems like either you stay there for 10 years, you either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become a villain. He might be getting in that villain territory.
Yeah, it's obviously weird and far-fetched to be like, oh yeah, Bill Self will leave Kansas to go to Oklahoma State. But then again, it's like, well, if any time, last year was a weird season for Kansas. And he basically says at the end of it, like, I checked out 3 weeks ago after they got blown out of the tournament by a kind of mid Gonzaga team. And it was like, what was that? What did he say there? Like, you're not really supposed to say that. That's very odd. And honestly, the way we're looking at it now, I know they won on Saturday, but would you be shocked if he tells you at the end of the season this year, hey, I checked out 3-4 weeks ago? Wouldn't shock me the way they're playing. And this is back-to-back years where they've had massive preseason expectations. This year they were preseason number one. It kind of falls apart in the way that Kansas falls apart. You know, Indiana falls apart. They don't make the tournament. Kansas becomes a 4 seed. But the thing that I found interesting throughout all this is people being like, oh yeah, I mean, what? This happens. They asked him for advice. He helped give. And I was like, does this happen?
Yeah.
Like, I could see Carolina going to Roy Williams or Duke going to Mike Krzyzewski. Those guys don't coach anymore. Like, you think this just happens all the time? I don't know. Do you think if Scott Drew left Baylor right now that Mack Rhodes would be calling up Jerome Tang to ask for advice or to hire him? Like, that's what we're talking about here. It's I don't think that's just common practice that, you know, every time Oklahoma State comes open that Bill Self's like, yeah, here's who I'd look at and here's why. It's odd when they're in your own conference specifically. It's very odd. And it did take a while for Oklahoma State to make this hire. I remember thinking that they were going to go get John Jacobs, who ends up going to FAU, the former Baylor assistant. And I was like, Oklahoma State still hasn't made a hire here. And so this is odd. There's something fishy about this one. Why would you leave Kansas at the end of the day? Except the villain thing.
The question of, does it matter that he played there in 1985? You know, like, does it matter today, 40 years later, that you're an alum? And again,
which comes up a lot in the all college sports.
Right. We all think, oh, well, Scott Drew grew up close to Indiana, must be going to Indiana. And you saw it with Mark Pope. Mark Pope takes a job that many people thought he had bitten off more than he could chew by going to Kentucky to go back to what he effectively called home. And for Self, like, yeah, of course, you're rooting, I guess, for your alma mater. But again, you're competing against them twice a year, beating the crap out of them for decades on end now as the head coach at Kansas. Is it worth, especially as a more senior coach, to take on a role like that at Oklahoma State? Again, this could be like a John Calipari leaving Kentucky to go to Arkansas, and they are probably going to miss the tournament this year. You know, is it worth tarnish? Because I think if you're Bill Self and you leave Kansas, it's a Kim Mulkey Baylor deal. It rivals that.
Go one of two ways, yeah.
Because now once you leave, you're not the statue coach. You're not the welcome back, we love you. It's, oh, I never really liked Bill Self. The national championships were fun, but he was a scumbag who had FBI investigations going on.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting point. I want to talk about the alum thing, because we all of us who do this and are watching and listening to this, we love our alma maters. We know what that poll would be like for us. But like, putting this into perspective, like, Oklahoma State's barely in this conference. I feel for them. It used to be a great basketball
football
program.
And basketball, by the way. They're the worst.
Sucks.
Their 2024-25 is the worst athletic year that any school has had in the Big 12.
They are wrestlers, okay? Like, that's what they are at this point. Like, Rick Pitino having this great season at St. John's. Is anyone thinking, oh, you know, that's where UMass's first call should be? He played there. Like, of course he'll come and rescue UMass, or Providence is not calling up Billy Donovan. And like, that's not that far off from what we're talking about here. Oklahoma State is is that much of a project, even at the Power 4 level. So I don't think it does matter because A, he's already coached there. He took them to a Final Four. And B, it is Kansas we're talking about. These guys, if they leave, they're leaving for the NBA. They're not leaving for their I'll just get one for the old alma mater, a guy in his mid-50s or whatever it is, 60. I don't know how old he is. Not just leaving for the grandeur of his alma mater and to hear the same old songs and go to the same old barbecue places. I doubt it. And we hear it all the time. We hear it in football as well as basketball that, oh, well, this is his place. This is where he would go. It's like that ship has sailed, man. He left for a bigger job 20 years ago. I do think it's weird, though, this kind of process and what's coming out here from this McMurphy report. That like how often has that happened? They've had 3 or 4 coaches since he was there. Does he get the call every time? Does it take a new athletic director? Did it take 10 years of him being away? I don't know. It's just you think Texas Tech the next time you think when Texas Tech was looking at Grant McCasland, they called up Chris Beard?
Yeah.
He's like, hey,
what do you think,
Chris? What do you think about this guy? Huh?
Could you advise us?
I know it didn't end well here, but
I like to
Mac
picture
Rhodes calling up Dave Bliss. Like, hey, we need some new assistants on this team. I just doubt it. I
like to think Mike Gundy has 4 or 5 beers, gets behind the wheel, gets in his car, calls up Bill Self. And it's like
Mike Gundy has a couple beers, gets behind the wheel, drives to a payphone, to call Bill Self.
Just to say, hey, just thinking of you. Just anytime you want to come to Oklahoma State, they'll take him with open arms.
Special thank you to Drake for having me. Love talking some ball there, talking some coaching carousel. Apparently, it's going to be weirder than we initially thought for the Big 12 this year. Let me know what you think about this Bill Self thing. I think it's weird. I think it's really weird, whether he's a member at the country club or not. Let me know down in the comment section below. As always, be sure to like and subscribe and find us wherever you get your podcast. That helps out the channel a ton. The reviews are great, but really just that you're listening there is huge. If you're driving or cooking or exercising and you want to just listen in podcast form, we're there too. Check us out there. Be sure to like and subscribe. Ring that notification bell to get notified every time we're dropping a video on YouTube. And then again, wherever you get your podcast. Thank you for making it your first listen today and every day. We'll see you tomorrow on Locked On Baylor.